Heritage Museum in the United States. And of course, I invite you to visit with us when you are able and to bring friends and family. We'll start the discussion off and then we'll follow up by opening the floor for questions at the end. Dr. Austin will have her book available. You have your book with you? We'll have her book available for purchase at the end of the discussion. Dr. Sharon Wright Austin is a professor of political science at the University of Florida. Her research focuses on African American women's political behavior, African American mayoral elections, rural African American political activism, and African American political behavior. She's the author of 5 books on these subjects, including The Caribbeanization of Black Politics. She has published several book chapters and articles, and she will publish her first children's book this year, Alan Learns to Talk, a story about autism. You can find her on X or Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. The Honorable Norman O. Hemming III. Norman has a degree in government and public administration earned at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Cornell University. He's a Merit Fellow graduate of Howard Law School, where he served as associate editor of the Law Journal and president of the Student Bar Association. He has a theology degree from Shiloh Theological Seminary in Stafford, Virginia, and is an ordained minister. So we'll behave. He presently serves as Chief Administrative Law Judge for the Miami, Florida, and Macon and Albany, Georgia offices of hearing operations. His list of accomplishments and accolades and awards is extensive, but his most important achievement is his role as a dutiful husband and father. Welcome to you both, and let's get started. I'm going to start off with a question for Dr. Austin and then for Judge Hemming. Dr. Austin, can you tell us set this scene for us? What was the landscape like in America in the 1970s in terms of politics, economy, race relations?
The 1970s is known as a major transition decade in the sense that it was still the height of the civil rights movement, but it's not commonly thought of as the height of the civil rights movement. And as far as Black immigrants, a lot of them had begun coming to America in the 60s. A larger number of them continued to come during the 1970s, but the cities were in trouble, especially larger cities like New York City, Miami. Financially, New York City was almost on the verge of bankruptcy. Crime was out of hand. There's always been political turmoil in the White House, of course. In the early 1970s, there was Watergate and Nixon resigning, and then later Gerald Ford didn't get reelected, then later Jimmy Carter. And so it was a major transition decade in the sense that there were a lot of immigrants coming to this country, but they were facing a lot of discrimination. But despite that, they were overcoming that, and you started to see more immigrants becoming citizens. You started to see them voting. You started to see them running for office. And a lot of the things now that we see in South Florida that we take for granted with the large populations of immigrants, a lot of that began during the 1970s. And a lot of the political power, even a lot of the plans for that began. So it was a major transition decade.
And Judge Hemming, what was happening in the Caribbean? Because there's a concept called push and pull, right? Where America was pulling us to come here and our countries were pushing us out of where we're coming from. So both of us are Jamaican. But if you can speak in the sense of Jamaica as well as the broader Caribbean, what were the forces that were pushing us out of the region in the 70s?
All right, thank you so very much for having me. So a number of things were going on. On the island of Haiti, 1971, we have Papa Doc passing away after executing a number of people publicly. We have his son in 1971 coming into power in Haiti. We have the US government releasing the economic embargo on the island of Haiti for this dictator. And so it seemed to the people living, the rank and file living in Haiti, that this was the end, right? That they had to get out. On the island of Cuba in 1976, in the 70s, we have Fidel Castro finally being elected as president of the country. And then in the island of Jamaica, what we have happening there in the 70s is a major transition. It's a major transition from the old colonial economy. It's a major transition in terms of education, a major transition in terms of economics, education, the social fabric of the nation. In fact, one of the most interesting things is that when Jamaica achieved independence in 1962, at the same time, or near the same time with Trinidad and Tobago, the literacy rate was less than 50%. But here now in the 70s, we continue to have this low literacy rate, but a change was happening. Literacy rates were increasing. At the same time, where access to secondary and tertiary level education was at one of its lowest points. So that was forcing people not only out of Jamaica, not only out of Trinidad, not only of Guyana and Barbados, but it was forcing people out of most of the Caribbean region to seek a tertiary level education here. At the same time, we had the ACP group of countries, with a major leader in that being Michael Manley. That is the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, and also the non-aligned movement, because remember what was happening elsewhere in the world, that these two forces, the old Soviet Union and the United States, seem to be pulling countries to one side or another. So there were all of these influx of things happening that were driving people, out of the Caribbean. Let me be short. All right.
It's amazing information. So we start arriving in this country, and we need to find our place, right? We were helpers of the building of this country. So how did we, as Caribbean people, begin to stake our claim in terms of how we were contributing to the workforce, the labor force, the economy of the United States?
Well, I think that the main thing that I see as someone who, I'm originally from the city of Memphis, Tennessee, and as we were talking before the panel began, the reason that I got an interest in studying Caribbean politics is because of my students at the University of Florida. Many of them are from the islands, and I've learned so much from them about their families and about politics, and that led me to want to study it. But the main thing that I see is cultural. As of course the politics, and in a remarkable amount of time, people of Haitian descent, Jamaican descent, people just generally West Indian, have made a lot of progress in American politics. And one thing that we need to think about in America is that there are so many obstacles there that still make it hard for people who don't have a lot of money, who don't have a lot of connections, people of color, women, especially women of color, to be able to make connections. And so for them to be able to make that type of progress in a brief period of time, despite all the obstacles and the discrimination that they face, is really impressive. But also the culture is something that I've always been fascinated with. I was asking about restaurants, because before I came to Florida, I had never tasted Jamaican food, and now I'm like addicted to it. And I was asking you about, can you recommend some restaurants, or even like Haitian food? Like one of my students made some Haitian mac and cheese, and I had never tasted that. So the cultural thing, like even now we take for granted all these restaurants and the different culture, the music and all of that, and arts and culture is also a huge influence of Caribbean culture.
Your thoughts, Judge Hemming, on the contribution to the economy that we have made since the 1970s?
So I think a number of things were happening in the 1970s. In the 1970s, here in the state of Florida, we saw the burgeoning sugarcane industry that was to just take flight. Whereas before in the past, the huge sugarcane producers would have been in Cuba and in Jamaica and elsewhere in the Caribbean. Suddenly in the 1970s, the folks who were pushed out of Cuba and who came here to South Florida started these large sugar plantations that really took off in terms of sugar production. And so it demanded a number of workers out of the Caribbean from all of these different islands coming here to South Florida, working from sun up in the morning till can't see at night. Sounds like slavery, right? But it's interesting. There's a very good book on that whole dynamic of what was happening here in the state of Florida. But at the same time, in New York, after the doctor had described what was happening in terms of the criminal unrest, the crime in New York, political unrest in New York and elsewhere in the United States, we had Cuban Americans moving not only to Florida, but into New Jersey and parts of New York. We had this huge influx of Jamaicans moving here for a number of reasons, right? So you had Jamaican nurses who suddenly found themselves with the ability to get jobs readily here in New York City, and to really make a major impact on the workforce. At the same time, we had this deluge of teachers, just like in now 2024, of teachers leaving the island to come and find jobs in New York and elsewhere. In addition to all of that happening here, what was happening in the United States was this notion of Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes had captured the imagination of most of the economic and political leaders. And he thought that at a time when we had stagflation in the United States of America, if we had a situation where the government started spending more money, that we could actually improve the job situation. And it actually worked for a while. Where at the same
stagflation is stagnant economy and inflation.
Exactly.
Okay.
But at the same time, you had jobs increasing in the United States because the government was just spending so much money doing that. So you had Jamaicans impacting all of that. At the same time, in New York in the 1970s, you'd have had someone like a Shirley Chisholm, who all the Caribbean people knew was from Barbados, and we're proud of her. She had made it to the state assembly, and eventually she would be also connected to Florida. She's actually buried here in Florida, Norman Beach. But she was also to become the first person to run for office. So that was seen as another avenue of things that Caribbean people could be involved in. We had people like Stokely Carmichael that was involved in the 60s and 70s in the student movement. And so people saw him. I know you want me to use his new name, right? Not Stokely Carmichael, so I apologize. Right, I'm just old. Right, but it's interesting. So all of these avenues were opening up, right? In healthcare, in teaching, in sugarcane industry, in other menial, in some menial jobs. Like my mom came here at that time as a housekeeper, leaving a so-called good job in the Caribbean to come here to clean toilets and to spread people's beds and take care of their children.
But you also saw a major increase in terms of education, especially in terms of higher education. You saw more people of color and more Black people of Caribbean descent or just of other descents going to college, earning different degrees, earning professional degrees, pursuing professions that even a couple of decades earlier were completely closed to Black people, people becoming things like judges, professors, and those types of professional positions. So you started to see a lot of that in the 1970s as well, a rise in the numbers of Black college students.
So I'm going to stick on that point. I'm going to stay with you, Judge Hemming, on this particular point. We in the Caribbean are often very big on education. Caribbean and Africa, right? The parents are big on education. There's a term that I heard coming out of Jamaica, brain drain, that happened around the 1970s, I believe, in the era of Manley and so on, where there was this push towards socialism. And can you talk about what that brain drain looked like? I mean, you kind of alluded to it here a while ago, but the professionals and the business owners and the plantation owners and so forth who left our shores and came to this country, and how that kind of affected the profile of the Caribbean community here.
Yeah, so a number of things were happening, right? So one, you had the Tanzanian president coming to Jamaica and meeting on Jamaican soil with the Prime Minister of Jamaica at the time in the 70s, Michael Manley. You had them coming out with a joint communique on what was happening in South Africa. You had them saying that we're now a part of this non-aligned movement. We're firmly within the grips of the ACP, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. And we want to see a realignment of how the economy is in the world. So you heard them saying we want to be independent and self-reliant, which sounds like a good thing, right? Unfortunately, when you're on the geopolitical sphere of influence of a large nation like the United States, and I'm glad to live here, so don't get rid of me, right? But you really can't say things like that, because what you start seeing happening is, as the sugarcane income went down for the island of Jamaica and elsewhere in the Caribbean, you had at the same time this movement towards independence, a movement towards saying that the Jamaican people, the people of Barbados, people of Trinidad, people of Guyana, of Cuba, should all be benefiting from the industries and the that are in their countries. And as a result, you found major US and European industries fleeing the Caribbean, closing down their operations. The bauxite industry saying, oh, great, you want some more money for your people living here? Although you have such a low, well, you have very poor infrastructure except for what was geared towards our industries. What we're going to do is we're going to move to Suriname, right? Because they have bauxite at a higher level on the table of the land, and we'll just mine it there and still ship it to America and see how you like that there. Oh, you think you'd like to get some more input in your hotel industry and in tourism? Well, we will just shift what we're doing in terms of our investments, because you levying a levy on taxes on our foreign-owned hotels here. We're going to show you that this is a bad way in which you go. So in terms of the brain drain, I see it actually as brain, not so much as a brain drain, because what was happening before was that most of the population in Jamaica did not have access to secondary school education or tertiary level education, right? Because these high schools that existed on the island of Jamaica and in much of the Caribbean were geared towards persons who were light, bright, and close to white. But you had a dramatic change in the 70s, where suddenly these children who couldn't attend high school before, people who looked like me, could suddenly go to Jamaica College or Casey, or I don't want to name colleges because people are going to get angry, right? So whatever high school you wanted to go to. However, what they found at the end of taking their GCE levels and getting their A levels after graduating from these high schools was that there was one major university in Jamaica, right? The University of the West Indies. There were a few teachers' colleges, and then there was CAST, but there weren't really very many opportunities, as the doctor was pointing out, for you to get a tertiary level education. So all of these families started saying, you know what? If I want my daughter or my son to become somebody, whatever that means, I'm going to have to take them to the United States or to Canada for them to get an education. So all the folks who had the ability and had the fortitude to become these great minds in the Caribbean ended up in New York City or ended up in Florida or in Chicago or elsewhere. And so that had a dramatic impact on the Jamaican economy, on the Jamaican educational system, and has impacted us, I think, to this very day, although we've seen some changes.
And the business owners during the time of Manley, was that a time when there was an exodus of those folks as well?
It's funny because this for me?
Yes.
Yeah, because we're here in Florida, right? So in fact, the Chinese Jamaican community, which were predominantly Hakka Chinese, who had become a major part of the Jamaican economy in terms of the private sector, they literally en masse immigrated here to South Florida. In fact, one of the largest Chinese New Year festivals occurs here in South Florida. I had a chance to speak there. I know I'm not Chinese, right? But or Chinese descent, but I actually have a number of Chinese in my family. The Chinloy family, one of the largest Jamaican Chinese families. But in any event, so they actually just immigrated right here to South Florida and just restarted their businesses here. They had been quietly stashing their funds abroad over time as they got concerned with how close Manley was getting to the Tanzanian president, how close he was getting to this notion of freeing South Africa, how close he was getting in terms of his identity with Cuba, how close he was getting in terms of his identity with Tito in Yugoslavia and the non-aligned movement. And so they literally just start relocating, right? So most of the folks who had the capital in Jamaica decided to let's wait out and see what is going to happen on the island of Jamaica, if there's going to be a change in this what they saw as a negative regime in the Manley government, and let's hold our funds overseas and stop the means of production.
So we're going to stay on the topic of politics now, right? And let us talk about, with Dr. Austin, what significant political and social movements were led by Caribbean immigrants in that decade of the 1970s.
Well, you already have mentioned Stokely Carmichael, who went later by Kwame Ture. He was very involved during the 1960s and continuing until his death in several different social movements in what we call Pan-African movements, not just here in America, but movements all over the world. So he probably is the best known activist. Shirley Chisholm. I haven't seen the movie on Netflix. I can't wait to see it. I think it just started last night with Regina King playing Shirley Chisholm. But I'm always really disappointed in my classes when I talk about her, especially my African American politics class. And so many people had never heard of Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman who saw a major party nomination in 1972 for the presidency. And even before that, she had done so much in politics and working with daycare centers, working in Brooklyn, first Black woman ever elected to Congress. And so a lot of people never heard of her. But she was also very much involved in a lot of social activism, even before she began her political career. And her political career during the 1970s, when she ran for president, she had a lot of mixed kind of experiences in the sense that people didn't think she could win. So a lot of people really, I'm sure the movie talked about it, but a lot of people really did a lot to stab her in the back. She was one of the founders of the Congressional Black Caucus in 1969, and yet even some of the people who founded that organization with her didn't support her when she ran for president, and even tried to derail her career when she was running for president. So those are just two of probably the most well-known people. But also there's another woman, the late Judge Constance Baker Motley was an activist. She also is a woman of West Indian descent. And she was the person who worked with Thurgood Marshall, the Brown versus Board of Education decision. She later became one of the first Black women ever to be a judge. And she also was very active throughout her life, but in the 1970s. So there are a lot of people who were very active in politics and also in activism, and especially during the 1970s and continuing on, that unfortunately a lot of people have never really heard of. And that's why it's so important to have things like what we're having here today to educate young people about their culture and about people who are these unsung heroes, but not even the more high profile people like the people that I've mentioned, but even some people who are possibly even in this room who've been involved in registering people to vote, spending time on a rainy Saturday, coming to hear people talk about these types of issues. It's important that we inculcate that kind of culture into our young people and educate them about our heroes, but also about people who even live in their communities, who are ordinary people who are making a difference. So I hope that answers your question. I know I have a tendency to ramble, but to answer your question, there were a lot of people who were very much involved in movements in the 1970s that were more well known, but also people who were just everyday people working to register people to vote, working to volunteer for campaigns. And those are the kind of people that we also need to highlight.
Sure. And I'm going to ask Judge Hemming the same question specific to Florida or South Florida as well. Who are those?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So in terms of the Cuban American community, we had all of these political leaders who came out of the island of Cuba or were direct descendants of them, who came to major political positions here in the state of Florida. There's some people, sorry to go back, because I can't leave, even though it's controversial, so calm down, folks, right? People, no, in terms of people who had major contributions. So Minister Louis Farrakhan, Jamaican parents, right? Who and other Caribbean, and his mom is from, right? Came out, and thank you so very much, right? Came out to be major influences here. Malcolm X, son of Caribbean. I mean, it's amazing, right? How these people influence not only Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, but there are these other leaders all throughout America in economics, in finance, in politics, who have just impacted us in such an amazing way. Coming out of the 1960s, where we had this dramatic change in the civil rights movement and the passage of the Civil Rights Act, 1965, etc. By the 1970s, it was these Caribbean nationals who came to the United States, along with their collaborators in the African American community here, because we're all African Americans, right? The archipelago runs from Florida all the way down to Guyana. It's all the Americas, right? I'm sorry to disabuse you of that, good Caribbean nationals, all right? But we joined together to produce some of the most amazing leaders in higher education. That's why now today we have a Trinidadian leading one of the most august. I went to Howard, so that's why I feel it's the most august, right? Historically Black institution, as president of Howard University. It's why we have
Kamala Harris.
And we have Vice President Kamala Harris, Jamaican and Indian background, where we have people, his family came earlier though, Colin Powell, his family actually came in the 1930s, but similarly, the strong connection to the Caribbean, but also in the era of music. When you think about African American music and hip hop and rap, right? These are folks who came out of the Caribbean. These are descendants of Caribbean nationals who started some of these genres. So we have so much in common with our brothers and sisters here in America, and we've contributed so much that it will be hard in this limited time period to name each and every one of these persons, because I'd leave people out and then you'd all get very angry.
And then there's one more person we have to mention, and we're speaking of music, Bob Marley. Wow. Yeah, I just saw the movie last week. But Bob Marley, his music was always phenomenal, but also the impact of his music, even in today's culture. And I think a lot of people don't know the impact of his music in terms of him trying to bring people together and to deal with some of the political turmoil and political divisions. And so he also, just through the songs that he was able to write and the activism that he engaged in during the 1970s, he also made a major contribution all over the world.
Yeah, before we go to culture, we're going to we're going to stay on politics for a little bit longer because Dr. Austin, you've written a book called The Caribbeanization of Black Politics. So can you talk about that topic and what it was that you explored in this book that you wrote?
Well, I have copies of the book. I have a couple of copies, and it talks about four cities: Boston, Chicago, Miami, and New York City. And it talks about a general history of immigration, of Caribbean immigration to those cities, and the impact politically of the people of immigration, of immigrant descent. And it talks about also their relationships with African Americans who were already here. And some of those relationships at times have been tense. I decided to write the book. It was published in 2018, but I decided to write it because so many of my students, as I mentioned, are from the Caribbean, and they've talked about just some of the problems that they had coming here with their parents as young children, and the way that they were treated. And the one thing that I found really disappointing was the fact that a lot of them said that sometimes they would be treated really badly by Black kids when they went to school. The Black kids didn't accept them, and sometimes even the white kids didn't really openly say things, but the Black kids did. And I even have heard things, even in my own community in Memphis, about stereotypes about people of other countries who are Black. And so those divisions, whether we want to admit it or not, they existed in the past and present. So in the book, I looked at just the ideas or the attitudes that each group has against the other, and whether or not the beliefs that there are stereotypes that Black people have, African Americans have against people who are of Caribbean descent and vice versa, whether or not that's true, and also whether or not with younger people, if they are less likely to have those negative views about the other group. And I found that that is indeed the case. And I think it's because younger people who were born and raised here, who maybe were brought here as children, were able to live in Black neighborhoods, were able to go to school with different people. And as a result, they don't have the types of stereotypes and negative views that maybe their parents or grandparents may have had. And I also look at the fact that despite whatever differences they have with each other, whether or not they come together politically, do they vote in high rates? Do they tend to vote for the same people? And in some cases they do, where they basically vote on the basis of issues, but do they tend to put their differences aside when it comes to their political activities? And I found that indeed that they do, especially looking at the example of Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. I think Black people just generally just loved him. So regardless of what your background was, or whether you were the children of immigrants or an immigrant yourself, they tended to come together for people like him, and they tended to put their differences aside also when there were incidents like police brutality in their communities. If someone Black was a target or a victim of some type of police abuse, the community came together and put their differences aside. So those are just some of the findings that I had.
You shared, I'm going to stay with you again. You shared something with me earlier, speaking about women or Judge Hemming.
Nice. Nice that ringtone though.
You were State Department.
Yes. So we forgive you. So we spoke a little bit earlier, and you shared with me something that I found very shocking, right? That Caribbean people, including specifically Caribbean Black women, will tend to lean Republican. And I'm curious to know what some of those findings were. And can you just share
Right.
how you came to that understanding, the trends with Caribbean women, Caribbean Black women? In general?
Right. I found that that's especially the case for whatever reason with people who are of Haitian descent, that I won't say that they lean Republican, but they're more likely to vote for Republican candidates or belong to the Republican Party than other people who are also of African descent, other Black people. And I won't say that it's a major rise, but even in 2016, when Donald Trump was running, he won, according to my records, about 20% of the Haitian vote. And that's a lot for a Republican candidate to be able to win. And so I'm not sure exactly what the reasons are for that. And I won't say that it's a large percentage, but there is a larger percentage of people of Haitian descent who are more likely to, I guess, be more conservative in their politics and be more likely as a result of that to support Republican candidates.
I'm gonna ask you the same question, Judge Hemming, because I assume when I hear stuff like that, these are patriarchal societies, right? The Haitian community is more patriarchal. There's some of that still in Jamaica. There are more women in positions of power, but I've been around Jamaican men and heard, hear them not really loving that that's a reality. So would you, if we're assuming here now, would you say that leads, or that's part of what leads to this kind of conservative Republican leaning, or do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I'd like to think that the Caribbean community is not a monolith, and especially the Haitian community is definitely not monolithic. That 2016, I like to think of it, I defer to you because you're the expert and you've studied, that's a one-off. It was a one-off in part because of what had happened in Haiti right before that election with Bill Clinton and them ascribing to Hillary things that allegedly her husband would have done in Haiti that some people thought may have been untoward. And I'm not saying one way or another. I don't know, right? I'm just a little judge here in Florida, right? So I think that might have impacted it. But I think in order to understand the mindset of some Caribbean nationals, you have to understand things that were happening before. So there was this whole group, also of the Caribbean, of people who, and you may have heard them say this. Maybe it's your grandparents, maybe some of you it's your parents. You'd have heard them say things were so much better off when we were under the rule of the Queen of England. Things were so much better off when we were under the control of France, right? And they say that not because they're wicked people, but because they just they're uninformed. They don't have the information. Had they known that under the colonial rule, that the GDP for most of the Caribbean was less than $500, right? Per capita. Had they known that the literacy rate was less than 50% in much of the Caribbean under colonial rule, had they understood that the high schools and the colleges were not intended for them and for their children and their offspring to attend to get higher education, then perhaps they would not have made some of the choices that they've made today. I think today we're seeing a change. We're seeing a change today, I believe, in the Haitian community here in South Florida, and also in New York in terms of their voting patterns. And maybe I'm just overly optimistic, and I don't go one way or another, whichever party they tend to vote for. But I think you're going to see a swing back for a decrease on that large percentage that went Republican, because things have changed and people have seen things in a very different light today. But it's the same when you think about folks like the Schomburg Library in New York, and the fact that that's a Caribbean national who founded that, and the things that he's done through that library to be able to get information out to members across the Caribbean diaspora, so that we have a better understanding of who we are as a people and what's in our best interest. I think you'll see things changing in terms of how we vote, in terms of how we act, and in terms of how we even think in this old colonial mindset. When you tell Jamaicans that public lands in Jamaica to this very day are still owned by the Crown, they say, well, Judge Hemming, you don't know what you're talking about. That is nonsense. No, it's true. Right? And you try to give them a sense of, we have to start thinking independently for ourselves, right? And once you start doing that and you start doing your own research, then perhaps you won't be so inclined to think that things were wonderful under colonialism.
Do you, or can you think of any notable contributions made by the Caribbean immigrants in the fields of art, literature, entertainment, specifically during the 1970s?
Well, I think I've already touched on a little bit with arts and entertainment. So I think I'll just defer to you.
So we saw, yes, and everyone knows all the names, right? It's just makes me seem as if I'm just naming things, right? So when you think about our the news industry or journalism in the United States, but when you have some people might say, well, he's not a journalist, right? Al Roker, right? Who kind of looks like me but just slimmer, right? Right? Who is seriously this descendant of Jamaicans and Bahamians who was totally impacted that area. When you think of folks as the current NBC, what's his name? No, not Al from NBC at nights when you're watching the NBC News. Because Lester Holt, right? Yeah. From Mandeville, right? This descendant of Jamaicans from Mandeville. When you think all across in Chicago, in Boston, out in California, all of these Cuban Americans who are on the air here in South Florida. I mean, it's totally amazing the things that they've been able to accomplish. But in terms of the art scene, when you think about folks in New York, and because I'm old, I'm forgetting names now, Caribbean, Jamaican and Haitian nationals who have, even though, what's his name, out of Haiti, and he was born on January 1st, which is interesting, Flag Day in Haiti, right? No, it's not Wycliffe, but he actually is one of the foremost artists today, even though he committed suicide at a young age.
Oh,
Yeah, his
Oh, yeah.
exactly. His artwork sells for
Yeah.
outrageous sums of money in terms of influencing the art world. We are just so amazing. And of course, you mentioned Bob Marley, right? But
Yeah.
it's not just Bob Marley, right?
Yeah.
Bob Marley was very instrumental, but you had all of these other reggae artists who were also interesting and who made really great inroads. And we talked about the rap scene earlier. And of course, in poetry, the legacy of Caribbean poetry in America and around the world is just phenomenal. And all of these folks will tell you that they were inspired by some of these greats coming out of the Caribbean.
And I just thought of some. I had, for some reason, blanked a minute ago, and plus, I like to listen to you talk. But anyway, I thought of some additional people from the 1970s, even that are some are still acting today. Some of our veteran Caribbean women actresses like Lorraine Toussaint. There's a woman named CCH Pounder. If you were able to watch this really good show that I just recently watched, Black Cake, it was a limited series on Hulu, and she was in that. And then also the late Madge Sinclair, who waged like a 10-year battle with cancer. She was also she's an actress that was known during mostly the 1970s and 80s because she died young. But she was also someone who was very active. So thinking about that decade, those are just some names that just popped into my head.
That when Flo was around.
Oh yeah, Esther Roll
Esther Roll,
of
yes.
Good Times. Yeah.
Yes, and I know Arlick did a piece on her last year, or was it the year before? So we're on culture now, right? We're on culture and arts, and we're talking about Bob Marley. And you had alluded to some Jamaican food or some Haitian food. Talk about some of the ways that maybe that 70s influx uniquely influenced us. And then if you have questions, I think we're going to wrap up shortly. So if you have questions, please think about those after we're done with this this question. Maybe one more we'll throw it to the audience.
Well, during the 70s, I think I talked about restaurants, but also just businesses in general. A lot of the businesses, even that we still see throughout the state, a lot of those businesses started in the 1970s. So I think when we think about Caribbean-owned businesses, we tend to think of them as being smaller, but that's not necessarily true because a lot of the Caribbeans were involved in corporations as well. So a lot of that foundation began during the 1970s as well.
And although we're dealing with culture, could I just say one, because they'll kill me if I don't say this. The Wilkie D. Ferguson Federal Courthouse, one of the largest and most beautiful federal courthouses anywhere in the United States, right here in the state of Florida, is named after a Bahamian national who had a tremendous impact on federal law here in South Florida and arguably around the world. But in terms of the impact of culture, I think you see here in the state of Florida especially, you see all of these so-called small businesses that started out as small businesses, and by women in particular, right? Especially some of these restaurants, right? Just think about when you think about Dutch Pot. This restaurant started by two Jamaican nationals, right? Who didn't seem that they had a lot of money available to them. I remember interviewing them when they were just starting out. And I was thinking to myself, will these people make it? I don't ask that anymore because every corner that I stop at, I see of one of their restaurants, right? But the impact that we've had in terms of the culture, in terms of language, in terms of what we call today Ebonics, and the impact that Caribbean nationals have had.
And that Hialeah Spanglish.
That's right. That's right. Right. It's funny. My mom is Cuban, right? Cuban descent, and my dad is Jamaican. And I hear. So when I hear and I listen to folks speaking Spanish from different parts of the world, I'm always amazed at the impact that that folks out of the Caribbean have had on how Spanish is even spoken in this area of the world. Caribbean people are amazing. They're amazing because they're human beings just like everyone else. They're amazing because they have a drive, a determination, and a motivation, not because they're better than African Americans who were born here in the United States, because they're just our cousins, right? You're just our cousins. The only difference between the two is that those folks who were coming out of the Caribbean tended, for the most part, in the 70s and 80s to be the so-called middle class folks coming to the Caribbean who are accustomed to seeing countries that had blacks as judges, as doctors, as prime ministers, as teachers, as nurses. And so that didn't seem like a strange thing to them. So it wasn't weird when they came here to the United States that they would move into an area of the Bronx that was known as Little Italy in the Bronx. And they weren't afraid to move in there, not thinking, oh, wow, my life could be at risk. No, no, they just thought it was natural for them to be there and to be living there. They didn't think it was strange for them to pursue tertiary level degrees, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and PhD degrees, because it just seemed like a natural thing that they didn't have access to back home in large measure because of what we outlined at the beginning of all of this. The amazing thing about Caribbean people is how much they are like everyone else in the world. They're just ordinary human beings who are asking for a chance to have equal access to education, equal access to participate in the economy, equal access to participate politically, equal access to raise their families in a safe and secure environment. And that's what I love so much about our people.
All right, thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Hello, this is wonderful.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, brother. Just let me go ahead. I'm sorry. This is wonderful. I'm sorry, more people aren't here, and we come here for drink milk, you know. We don't come here for count cow. You understand? And anybody who understands what I'm saying understands what I'm saying. Now, the Rastafarian movement has had a big impact. And Bob Marley is a Rastafarian, because when I came here in 81, because I was in Jamaica in the 70s, so all of that political turmoil and so forth, I went through that, and I was a big supporter of democratic socialism and Michael Manley. But when I just came here, when I see a man with dreadlocks and so forth, he was a Jamaican Rasta. Now when I come, I see so much people with dreadlocks, and that is that influence. Now, one of the advantages that I think Jamaicans had coming here is we came from a predominantly black culture where the skin color was shades darker than me. And I acknowledge my privilege and my experience. I don't acknowledge that already and so forth. But people who came from Jamaica, because black people, Akiseed black, you understand, drove the culture because they were a majority, came here with a certain amount of confidence and assurance. One of the problems is we have to acknowledge what black Americans has done. Martin Luther King, when Marcus Garvey came here, so that we could come here with a certain kind of confidence and enjoy the experience and take the benefits that black America laid down for us. And what I would say is we should celebrate what we have in common and not worry about the little cultural differences and so forth that we have, you know? So, but there's a million more things I could say because this is so wonderful and a lot of you said it all. But one of the questions I really want to ask is, as black people, right? And I don't have anything against any other people, but as black people, now, what is the best way to move as a people forward to have more education, more judges, more people of influence, but also to get generational wealth? You know what I mean? Because that is what we need, you know. We need to capitalize our community. We need to educate our community and move forward so that when the decisions are being made, we have a seat at the table and we have an impact in the economy. Because the thing that influences America most is money and the movement of money and capital. That is what when you want to understand America, you need to understand what is best for capital. And that is how decisions are made. Down in Gaza, anywhere in the world, it is what is best for American capital and American ruling class that move America.
Thank you.
I'm going to take a quick stab at that one. I'm going to say two things. Number one is vote.
Yes.
Because we tend to think I've bristled at people and fires come out of my ears because somebody tell me, oh, it doesn't, no, nothing else matters except the presidential election, and it's not the
Mhm.
president who deals with our school system here,
Yeah.
and the
Local issues.
policies that affect us here locally. Dr. Austin came here and said, this is the first time she having Jamaican food, around the Jamaican people and the Haitian people and whatever. We are a different makeup of a constituency in South Florida than anywhere else in the state, even. So we have to represent or make our voices heard in a way that is going to represent us. And the only way we can do that is by our vote, number one, and by getting involved ourselves. I became a museum founder not because I know anything about museums, but I saw a lack of representation. I came here from Jamaica and was wearing it 20 years ago. And every time you see me, I'm wearing my Jamaican colors and carrying on, whatever. And because I was not seeing somewhere that I was reflected, I knew people who were Jamaican, and we were over here in a little corner talking to ourselves and in the echo chamber of, yeah, you're cooler than this one and who is cooler than that one. And only in creating relationships with Haitian people and eating, understanding that Cuban people have them rice separate from them beans, who knew, right? Only in going through those processes did I start to feel that there was a community around me here. And it led to, okay, well, I don't see a space that is bringing all of us together. So I'm going to take the initiative and create one. And I think the way that we make change is by making change, right? You have to get up and do the things or find the people. If you are not, if you don't have the capacity to do it on your own, the network or what have you, find the people, raise your voice and say, we need to find somebody to do this, and look for that person or look for that organization and do your part in advancing the welfare of the entire human race, right?
Yes. Yes, I agree. I just want to just add, you also, of course, I would say voting as a political scientist and getting involved in politics, but also I would say make sure that you're aware of what's going on in your communities, and make sure you're aware of what's going on even in our state. Because when you think about the fact that books have been banned, that teachers are now being told not to talk about different racial concepts. Even as a professor at University of Florida and other universities, professors and educators are being told not to talk about race. So if you do talk about race, this is the way you're supposed to talk about it. Or even with diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, even at my universities, just a couple of weeks ago, they closed our chief diversity office that they had just opened in 2021, and they got rid of the chief diversity officer, and they fired 13 employees. And so that's something that we should be aware of. And when you vote on election day, make sure you remember who did those things, and make sure you remember to take a stand.
So, so definitely voting is very important. I'd like to address one thing and then I'll finish up with this. With respect to the dreadlocks, right, as you called it. So I had a chance to live for about a month with the Baba Shanti community in Jamaica, studying the human ecology of the Jamaican society. The first day that I was there, I had to stand outside in the sun for 12 hours because I traveled in a van with women who had been seeing their period. And so I was unclean before going in. The next time I moved to New York City, and in New York City, I went to a restaurant to buy some food. I was standing in line, but the guy ahead of me had this huge head of dreadlocks, and he was ordering jerk pork. And I was shocked. I was totally shocked because
Sorry, for those who are American, Rastafarians in Jamaica do not touch pork, do not touch shell. They don't. A lot of them don't do meat at all. So pork is the sin of all sins. Yes.
So I was really shocked based on my understanding of what a Rastafarian was. But then I realized, no, this is just the impact that Caribbean nationals have had in culture here in the United States. But I say that to say this: not only should you vote, but not only should you know who you are in terms of your history beginning before slavery, beginning before the Caribbean, and the greatness of our people, right? Going back thousands of years before, even to the very beginning, but it's to know whose you are. If you're a Rastafarian, understanding whose you are as a Rastafarian. If you're a Christian, understanding whose you are as a Christian, and your place and your faith all throughout the Bible. Mm-hmm. If you're Muslim, as Muslim or Muslim brothers and sisters are celebrating Ramadan during this time period, is to understand whose you are. It's funny, I grew up in Jamaica around a family. You might have heard of him before, Prince Busto, who was one of Jamaica's most prolific artists, because we mentioned only Bob Marley. But Prince Buster was actually a committed Muslim and a very close friend of the Muslim community here in the United States. But he had to hide who he was on the island of Jamaica, and his children had to hide what they were doing during Ramadan and why they didn't eat pork like Rastafarians, right? Because of the fact that people didn't understand or appreciate whose they were. So you need to vote, you need to understand who you are as a people, but you also crucially must understand whose you are. Because when you have a sense of whose you are, you realize that nothing is forbidden to you and that you can achieve everything that you put your mind, your heart, and your soul to.
Yes.
And you made the point that it does not matter whether you are Democrat or Republican or what letter is beside your name. You can be conservative and not ascribe to certain policies and behaviors that are going to make immigrants feel ashamed to be immigrants, or children feel ashamed to think about or talk about where they come from. So it's not about political parties, it's about beliefs. And again, going back to your whose you are and finding people who are aligned with how you think and how you feel, and who make you feel good about, you know, pulling, you don't pull a slut for to vote anymore, but to putting your thing in the bubble, right?
But I just
Yes.
wanted to make one more quick point, because I don't think we really addressed the comment about economic power, because political power is important, but that's been a debate in politics for years, like to what extent should we focus on political power? Politics and voting is important, but economic power is even arguably even more important. And so when the speaker was talking about generational wealth, that's also something we should teach our young people about spending. And I'm saying that because of my own teenage daughter who loves to spend. And we have to teach them about, you know, valuing the Black dollar and being careful about what you buy and saving. And so those are
You
also,
support with
yeah,
your
values
dollars.
that we didn't mention before, but that is also something we should teach our young people.
So I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that. I know you're waiting for your question.
Yes.
So it's funny. I became a judge, or I became a public servant all of my life because I didn't know anything else. And my mom told me, you need to get a good government job. That's the way to get ahead. Fortunately for me, for my children, I had my wife who was much smarter, probably than my mom. My mom is not here, so it's fine. Right? And so she taught our children that they could go into business. So my daughter, who is the youngest of our children, she's a social media influencer. And so today she earns so much more money than I have ever earned in my life. My son, who is now a lawyer as of last year, is earning so much more than me as well, because he decided not to go into government service. He's actually doing medical malpractice law, and he's earning so much money. So yes, we need to tell our children, don't rely on the old ways of doing things, because that's all my mom knew. So she taught me what she knew. But allow your children to have some liberty to do more.
So I don't know. This is not working. Yeah, is this working? I guess. I was teaching 8th grade last year at Millennium, and the history. And the question I posed to the students in the beginning of the year was, "Are you African?
Are you
Because
African?
Are you African?" Because I could care less of where you stopped off, where the colonizers distributed us. But in the room, it was mixed, and the students didn't want to identify with Africa. That's not where they saw their origin coming from. They would brag about coming from the Caribbeans. They would brag about coming from Jamaica, all of these places where the colonists dropped us off. And my point to them was that we're never going to be free until we go all the way back to Africa. And if you want to talk about economics, Africa has the major resources that drives this country. And after World War II, they divided it up. And there's not a rich nation in this world that hasn't thrived off of Africa. So Tesla is looking for its resources, and they're paying $1 a week for those kids that are getting all of that resource for the batteries that they have to have. And we fought the battle to free here and throughout the world to free South Africa, but there's still, until we take control of the resources of Africa, until we understand that that's how we're going to be free economically, We can debate about, carving up the crumbs here, but that's not going to free us in the world. When I grew up, nobody wanted Chinese toys. They were cheap. Now you can't find them. When I grew up, there was American RCA, electrical, refrigerators, everything. Find one today. So my point is that when those nations, Japan, found its resources and they stuck together, now you look at the Japanese and you're like, wow, they're amazing people.
What's your question?
So when you find the Chinese, it's the same way. So my question is, when I hear this discussion, and I admire, Black Americans, Jamaicans, but if we keep talking like this, divide and conquer is how they win. And how do you think they got this country? They got natives fighting each other. How do you think they got us over here? They had natives fighting each other. And if we keep doing this, our children are never going to get the message. So if I'm talking to 8th graders and they don't understand that they're African, that we are all one, we're in real trouble.
So so I'm going to ask you to address it, but I'm going to ask you as well. Talk about that difference, that difference between, yes, we're all of African descent, but there's also a perspective where you have to also understand your uniqueness and recognize your uniqueness. And I think that when we talk about being Caribbean American or Jamaican American, it's recognizing that uniqueness rather than trying to divide. But what is your thought on that perspective?
Well, I just wanted to say quickly, in the book, I did talk about some of the divisions between people who are of Caribbean descent versus people who were already here who are also Black, of just divisions among people of African descent, just generally. And one of the things, I don't know if you've ever heard of the one drop rule, which basically says that if you have one drop of Black blood, you're Black. And so I talk about the fact in the book that a lot of people immigrated to this country who were of African descent. And when they came to America, they were Black, which meant they were Black American. And at the time, especially during the 1960s, before the Civil Rights Act, that meant that they had to live in Black neighborhoods. They had to deal with segregation, because even Miami was one of the most segregated cities in the nation, legal segregation. And they had to deal with the same types of discriminations that other Black people dealt with. And so a lot of people who were from the islands resented that. And a lot of people who even immigrated here from Africa resented the fact that they were called Black, and they didn't see themselves as being like people who were from backgrounds like myself, who could trace their lineage back to slavery and Jim Crow. And they resented that. And so that's why I think when you see a lot of even the ethnic and cultural heritage and cultural pride with people saying that I'm Jamaican American, a lot of it is because, according to what I found in my research, that they wanted to sort of, I guess, even rebel against being called Black and being looked at, oh, you're just Black. And so they wanted to say, yes, I'm Black, but I am also Jamaican American. I'm also Haitian American. So there have been different types of differences, but he did make a very good point. Because even I noticed it even when I was a child, when if someone said something to you that in any way insinuated that you had any kind of African quality, I think we can all, those of us in the room who are Black, can remember hearing the comments about, oh, somebody's hair, or somebody's lips, or somebody's nose, or your skin color. And colorism is a big issue also among people of African descent. So that's a very good point that he made. If the 8th graders that he teaches don't want to think of themselves as being African, then we have a problem.
So I like to think of myself first as being an African living in America.
Yes.
And then I'm Jamaican American or Cuban American or whatever else monikers you want to put on me. But this is what's important, I think. You have to give children, and thank you for that question, a reason to want to be African, yes, and to celebrate their Africanness. So if you don't remind the children that if they want to be a success economically, they have to become like Mansa Musa. And that Mansa Musa, when he moved his entourage from West Africa all the way up to what we call today Saudi Arabia, that he caused a worldwide depression with the amount of gold that he had dropped all over the world. If you remind them that these people who are called the Moors, the reason that you have these cathedrals in Central America and South America and in Portugal and in Spain that are called Matamoros Cathedral. It's the Kill the Black Cathedral. The reason that they're named that is because you as an African was there before slavery. You had been in control of the Iberian Peninsula. In fact, you were all the way over into Germany. In fact, the name Schwarzenegger, Arnold Schwarzenegger, means black plowshare. That's because of your influences in Africa on Germany. The fact that the national dance of England is the Morris is because of you or more. It's not just Princess Christine or whatever her name is, right? That is a part of your heritage. If you explain to them that so many of the things that we look at and we hold up, when you think about the fact that the Grand Pyramid of Giza is taller than the Empire State Building, that Dr. Sheikh Antaji approved, that these the bodies of the pharaohs who ruled during major portions of Egypt through what's called the dosage melanin test were darker than I am. So these are who your people are. Then you give them a sense of being proud of who they are. When you tell them that, listen, before slavery, you Africans in North Africa brought public libraries and indoor plumbing to much of what we know today as Europe during when they were going through a time called the Dark Ages. Then when you give children an understanding of who they are, maybe I didn't spend enough time, I spent so much time on whose they are, I didn't spend enough time on who they are, then they'll be proud to call themselves an African. But even post-slavery, they will continue to be proud to call themselves African. When every time they stop at a traffic light, every time that they see a refrigerated truck, every time they turn on the AC at home, you just remind them who they are, that they have so much to be proud of after slavery, so much to be proud of before slavery, and so much to be proud of in general as just being a human being.
And this is going to be our last question. Thank you so much for that, Judge Shaming.
I'm really enjoying this. I have so many questions or issues that I want to raise, but I know we don't have time for that.
One more for today.
But the one question, one of the things that really shocked me when I moved here from Brooklyn in 1980 was meeting upper middle class, mainly from Jamaica, who left Jamaica. It was like a mass exodus of upper middle class Jamaicans because they felt that they were escaping socialism and they were angry. I moved to North Lauderdale first, and I went to this laundromat, my husband and I, and it was a Jamaican woman, upper middle class, that had left Jamaica, and she was so angry that she felt that she had to leave. Okay, that was one issue. So if you can talk about the exodus of the upper middle class Jamaicans that left during that time period and why they left and what their impact has been on South Florida. I think one of the impacts is the flourishing of a lot of businesses. Okay, another issue that I want to raise is meeting a lot of educated Jamaicans that were very critical about the Rastafarians. Bob Marley covered a lot of that in his movie and how they treated them. I had a Jamaican boss, and she talked about how these people were coming from the mountains and coming into Kingston and just destroying Kingston with the nappy hair, and how the Rastafarians were demonized by Jamaicans, particularly the upper middle class Jamaicans. Now everybody is embracing them, and all Jamaicans are talking about Rastafarians with pride, but they don't remember when they were being demonized. The other issue, if you could touch on just a little bit, is the intermarriage between Black Americans and people from the Caribbean.
So which one of those three questions? we spoke about the business people moving out earlier. You may have not been in the room at that time.
If you can talk about
one?
the exodus.
The exodus, okay. Wait,
and the impact.
okay. We spoke about that one earlier, but
So thank you, great question. So in terms of the Exodus is in part linked to the Rastafarian question as well. So let me do this. All right. So growing up on the island of Jamaica, I remember going to my grandmother's house, and my cousin who became whatever. All right. He was in med school, so he brought home this young man to the house. The young man had a full head of locks. And when he came into the house, grandma jumped out of her seat. She said, "Oh my God, thief come to rob us." Right? Thieves came to rob us. And so he said, "No, no, no, grandma, it's not a thief. He's actually in medical school with me." But all grandma could think of was, no, this is a little, and her words, not mine, a little dirty Rasta boy. Because that's how they were seen. In fact, the Rastafarian movement in Jamaica actually had themselves under siege in Jamaica by Jamaicans. Literally, right? Communities were attacked in Jamaica. But that's in part due to the fact that people didn't understand who they were, right? So they didn't understand what this was. So today, when you have this large Rastafarian population living in White House in Ethiopia, when you have differences among the Rastafarian community in terms of the 12 tribe, I talked about living with the Baba Shanti, but when Jamaicans started realizing that the 12 tribe, who most of them are doctors and lawyers and are actually the part of the moneyed classes in Jamaica, suddenly there was a little bit of a difference view on that. And then the second part of the question that you're asking about is, what was the second part of that question? I'm so sorry. Socialism. All right. So democratic socialism. So it's interesting why a lot of this middle class Jamaicans left. So you remember I talked about earlier, I don't know if you were in the room, that there was this thing called the common entrance examination. And the common entrance examination determined your fate forever. At age 10 years old in Jamaica and in much of the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean, you took this exam. And based on this exam, you could go to high school free of cost, right, paid for by the government of Jamaica. Very few people were able to accomplish that. And in order to accomplish that, your parents had to spend an exhaustible amount of resources to get you private lessons so you could actually pass that exam. And you had to go to some of the better elementary or primary schools on the island of Jamaica to accomplish that. Suddenly in the 1970s, this was all upended. Because if you didn't go to high school, you went to what's called a secondary school, you could become a tradesman, right? Whether you're a boy or a girl. And for many of them, their education stopped at the 9th grade, right? That sounds horrible, doesn't it? But when the 1970s came and there was this big social movement and a transformation of the educational system to say no, that education is universal for everyone. And folks, no matter of your socioeconomic background, you need to have access to this thing. If you were one of the beneficiaries of the system before, you would be thinking to yourself, I don't want these low-class people, attending my son's school, right? So when you look at the high school yearbooks, just if you ever get a chance to look online, because they're all online now, the websites for all of these high schools in the Caribbean, you will notice that there is a color change in the 1970s through to today. Prior to the 1970s, when you look at all the alumni photographs, you're going to see mostly white. Then you see a transition to white, Indian, and Chinese. And then mysteriously in the 70s, this explosion of people who look like me on the alumni picture boards. So that is one of the reasons why these folks have left, because they didn't understand who they were. They didn't understand that if you're held down, if anyone in your society is held down, everyone in the society is held down. That's so that you have to get to this point in your life where you begin to say, I will not sit idly by and quietly just because I'm in a position of privilege, while someone else who looks like me, who comes from a background like me, is being oppressed. When you get to that point, change happens.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Thank you very much, Dr. Austin. Thank you very much, Judge Hemming. I am Calibe Thompson from Island Space Caribbean TV. That was our last question. I'm so sorry. If you have questions for the judge and Dr. Austin, I do believe that they might hang around a little bit and you can chit chat with everyone. And we
Thank you all
so
very much.
Thank you.
Oh, it's so nice to meet you. Yes. I learned so much even.